Hey, welcome to Dad Space, a podcast for dads by dads. Today we have with us Christopher Veal coming on the podcast to talk about his book and being a dad right here on Dad Space. Thank you for listening. Make sure you go follow us on the Dad Space podcast on all the social media platforms, all that great stuff. Thanks for listening. Here we go. Christopher Veal, Dad Space. Enjoy. Dad Space. Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the podcast. Today, I have a great guest with me today, and he has an interesting license plate, which probably we shouldn't mention on a podcast. We probably should backtrack a little there. But anyways, Christopher Veal is here with us today, and he has a little thing that he has used in the past. I love it. It's a kind of this datitude type thing, and it really fits well with our new podcast Dad Space. But Christopher's also here to talk about his book, The Whole Man. So we have many things to talk about. Christopher, welcome so much to the podcast.
Yeah, very glad to be here, David. Very glad.
Awesome. Excited to have you here. Love to kind of go through this and chat with you as well. You have a podcast as well?
I do. I have a podcast called The Vulnerable Man.
Okay, let's talk about that right off the top. How long have you had this?
I launched it in July of 2020. Okay. So a little over 2 years.
Awesome. And how's it going so far as a podcaster?
Good. Yeah. You know, it was one of the latest iterations of the work that I do. So I'm on a quest to destigmatize the word vulnerability for men. Okay. Plain and simple. And I've been interviewing men around the subject since 2016. And in early 2020, I was talking to a gentleman and I realized I love these one-on-one conversations. And if I want to have the impact I really want, I need to be having more people hear this. And I thought, what about a podcast? I knew nothing about starting a podcast, running a podcast. And so I put it out to my universe and I said, hey, anybody in my network know about podcasting? And fortunately, a gentleman I know by the name of Dan Class reached out and said, I've been podcasting since podcasting started. Happy to take you under my wing. And so he really just helped me get things set up. And that was in mid-May. And by July, I launched the podcast. And so it's great because what I love about the podcast is I get to share other men's stories about their journeys, the successes, the failures, what's worked, what hasn't, and the impact that happens when they're able to lean into vulnerability more.
Okay, so let's talk about that right there off the bat. Can you give us a little sense of what that really means in a practical sense?
Sure. I mean, I could go in about 47 different directions on that, but at its core, one of the things that I believe is as young boys and as men, we aren't necessarily given the messages that we can be vulnerable. When you look at the way that men, and I'll use the air quotes, are portrayed in the media and in television and in all kinds of things, there tends to be this alpha male that is idolized, and that's the way to be, which means never fail, always win, never ask for help, win at all costs, and never show emotion. Heaven forbid you show emotion. You can show anger and maybe a couple other ones in a very limited scope. And so what these boys hear, that I'm not a man. And vulnerability is way outside that, because a lot of men grow up thinking vulnerability, that's weakness, and I can't do that. And so what I find is, as I'm talking with men, and I have been for the last, as I say, 6 or 7 years, a lot of them are realizing they have this yearning, this craving for being able to be more vulnerable and be connected, because to me, that's the beginning of where connection starts. And when they're able to experience it, they feel more of a connection with other men. And that's where they struggle a lot. A lot of them are capable of showing vulnerability with the women in their lives, but are afraid sometimes to do it with men. And so leaning into the vulnerability means that willingness to go first, to say, I'm going to be open a little bit. I don't know how it's going to be received, but that's not going to stop me.
Wow. Okay. That's interesting. Yeah. Oh, no. Okay.
I mean, I could have gone on a whole lot longer, but I'm like, that's kind of it. Okay. At its core.
The podcast and having these interviews and having time with your guests, how has this kind of helped you develop as far as writing a book, and how does that help you developing in your business, and how are you taking that knowledge and applying it?
Sure. So in terms of the book, I've had this idea for probably 8 or 10 years. I did a leadership program, a year-long leadership program back in 2015. And when I came out of it, my leader quest is something you do was really to expand the conversation around men and vulnerability, because I knew I was on a journey of my own to figure out what my relationship with vulnerability was and where I was resisting it or avoiding it, or most of the time just pretending it didn't even exist. And as I've progressed, what I realized is it culminated in a couple of different ways. One was my TED Talk, which, even though it wasn't about vulnerability, it was about vulnerability. A couple of years later, started the podcast, and I've always had this idea of writing a book in the back of my head, but wasn't quite sure when and how and what it was going to be. And then last year, at the start of the year, I said, it's finally time. I've kind of kicked this can down the road far enough, and it's time to put up or shut up. And so I said, I'm going to write a book this year. And I did it. And what I've realized is it's not, I mean, it's partially my story, but it's also the stories of men that I've talked to. But it's a journey of the stories of a lot of men that I've talked to, and sharing some of the things that have helped them be successful. And I essentially boil it down into 5 habits of the whole man, but it's a way to help us change the narrative. And so the title of the book is The Whole Man: Evolving Masculinity. And I purposefully chose the word evolving because for me, what was important is with evolution, here's the thing. There are some good things about being a man, and there are some things that maybe are holding us back as well. And what I believe is when you look at evolution, organisms will take the parts of themselves that they need and then get rid of the rest and bring on and adopt new qualities and characteristics in order to thrive in their changing environments. And so I think that's what we need to do with masculinity is we need to keep the parts that still serve about being a man, because there are good qualities, but then also bring on and expand the definition of how we hold masculinity so that we can meet the challenges that we're facing now and we're going to face in the future. And a big piece of that is really shifting from this mindset of either or type of thinking, like either I can be strong or I can be sensitive. Either I can be a breadwinner or I can be a caretaker for my family, and really start to step towards a both and type of mentality.
So I'm curious as to some of the things that maybe one thing that you would suggest is something we need to set aside as a man, something that we don't need to carry forward with us that maybe has traditionally been stereotypically male.
Sure. I mean, one of the biggest ones is how we approach emotions, and the fact that a lot of us really don't let ourselves show emotions, or we haven't learned how to be with emotions. You know, as you look at little kids, I use the example of you take a little boy and a little girl, and I'm speaking in binary terms, and I know we're beyond that in our world, but it will work for this example. But you take a little boy and a little girl, 3 or 4 years old, and every emotion that comes through them comes right out. If you've ever been around little kids, you know that. So they'll laugh, they'll cry, they'll cycle through all kinds of things in a 20-minute span, and you will be exhausted. But around the age of 5 or 6, that little boy and that little girl start to get very different messages when they show emotions. So if a little girl starts crying, people we tend to coddle them and take care of them and say it's okay. But if a boy does that, the messages he hears, don't cry, suck it up, be tough, that whole type of mentality. And so what happens, whether consciously or unconsciously, is this little boy says to himself, oh, so tears or sadness aren't appropriate because that's not what I should be I don't even think like as a man, but that's the kind of thinking they start to hear. Then you get into sports, into like middle school and high school, and it's even more amplified, right? Some of the things that, and it's not to knock, sports coaches, but a lot of that mentality out on the field, like I played football, I played basketball, it's suck it up, be a man. One of the worst insults you can give a young boy is don't be a girl. And so what they hear is, okay, I have to be a very specific way. And that's the way to be a man and be accepted by my peer group. And I think that's one of the biggest things that we need to really put aside to be able to evolve and help young boys and young men learn how to have that emotional literacy, that capability to process and feel emotions so that they don't continue to stifle them. And then it erupts in all kinds of unhealthy ways.
Okay. So that's something we set aside then. Does it go hand in hand, but is there something we adopt that you can think of off the top of your head?
Well, I think with it, it's also when we see examples of men that are showing that emotional health, that emotional maturity, that willingness to show emotions, we celebrate it. So I like to use the example again. You think about your typical action hero movie, and your hero is usually big, muscle-bound guy, typically a loner, can do it by himself, wins at all costs. And his sidekick is usually the comic relief, who maybe is a little more emotional, maybe sometimes cries, maybe is less manly. And so the message we hear then as well is, oh, if you want to be the hero of the story, you've got to be this big, strong alpha male type of personality, and anything less, you're just the sidekick. And so we need to be able to show that when those men are showing emotions, that is also strength. That is also part of being a man. And when they start seeing more of those examples, then it becomes the rule and not the exception.
So from your perspective, how do we as men, as dads, spouses, partners, how do we show up better?
It takes work. I mean, honestly, the first thing is you have to get clear about where you are around it. Be honest with yourself. How am I in terms of the way that I show emotions, that I experience emotions? Do I disassociate from some of them? And so getting clear on where you're at is a big piece, because you can't make progress to where you want to go until you're really clear on where you're at. And then I think it's the willingness to start trying it a little bit more. And it can be very scary. A lot of the things that keep us as men, and I'll speak as men, but it applies to all people. Brene Brown talks a lot about it. It's shame. And so we sometimes feel like if I show vulnerability, I will be seen as less than or not strong. And there's judgment. And so because of it, we hold back. And what the majority of men that I've talked to, I won't say all, because there's no absolutes. Well, there's an absolute there, but absolutes are rare. But what I'll say is the majority of men that I've talked to over the years, when I ask them, what gets in the way of you being more vulnerable with other men in particular, and a lot of the times it's those things, that judgment, that worry about being seen as less than. And then I say, and if a good friend of yours, a buddy of yours, shared something that he was struggling with, how would you feel about it? And almost every one of them says, oh my goodness, like something to the effect of, I'd feel proud. I'd feel honored that he would share that with me. And then I just sit back and I wait, and I can see the wheels turning, and suddenly it's like, oh, they realize that when they see vulnerability in others, they see it as an asset. But whenever they think of themselves being vulnerable, they see it as a liability. And that's where we need to shift the thinking as well.
How important do you think it is for men, dads, whoever's listening to this, to be in community with other men, dads, guys that can assist and support and help you as a guy trying to figure this out? Because again, that lone wolf you mentioned as the superhero on movies, there's a lot of men that are living that lone wolf mentality every day, and in their loneliness making poor decisions or unsure of their next move. But having a community around you really does help. What does community mean to you?
It is absolutely critical. Yeah. So community it's a part of what I talk about in the book. Like I call it find your tribe. And what I know is, as human beings, we are hardwired for connection. I mean, you think about it. You think back to our ancestors, like they gathered in herds and not herds, but like in tribes and in groups, because that's what we are naturally drawn to do, is connect. And so where it can be really powerful is when if it's just two men that get together and have a conversation, and you start to realize, I hear your stories and I realize, wow, like your story isn't the same as mine, but I can see some similarities, and I can go, oh, wow, like I've had some struggles like he has. It automatically helps us feel a little less burdened by what was weighing us down. And so that sharing is a powerful piece. So community is absolutely critical. It also helps normalize things, because so many men, because we are taught this, do it on your own, never show weakness. They think I'm the only one. And until they hear another man say, yeah, I'm struggling with this, they think no one else is dealing with it. And so I'm a failure because I'm the only one. And so that community is critical, because it's another support element for us.
Yeah. And I think too, like if you look at a prison setting, for example, punishment is loneliness and segregation and putting in isolation. That's a form of punishment.
Yes.
And there's so many men that
absolutely
think that I'm just going to do this myself and you're really punishing yourself when community is supposed to be our default,
Absolutely.
not isolation.
Yeah. So I had a gentleman by the name of Eldra Jackson on my podcast a year or two ago, an amazing man. But he talked about when he was in prison, he said the absolute worst thing that ever happened to him was being put in solitary confinement, because you are shut off from everything else. And it is. Yet we, for some reason, close ourselves off because we feel that's what we have to do. And that's part of why I wrote the book, why I do the podcast, why I want to spread this message, because we need men to know that isolating themselves is not the way forward.
Wow. Okay, so tell me a little bit about how this book is helping to open doors for people that are reading it. How is this what's the response to the book? And maybe just a little bit more about the book as well.
Yeah. Well, I think it starts with, I got to go back to the why I wrote the book. And really, at the end of the day, my primary reason for starting and continuing this work is my daughter. And what I know is I want to be the best father I can for her. And more importantly, I want her to grow up seeing firsthand what healthy masculinity can look like. And so with that, that's what continues to help me go forward. And some days I do better than others. There's some days where I get a check mark in the box and I go, hey, I got better. And there's some days where I'm like, whoops, I was human today and I took some steps back. But in terms of, the messaging, to me, I talk about the idea of healthy and unhealthy masculinity. And healthy masculinity, I think, embraces that the way we define masculinity is expansive and inclusive. It isn't divisive and seeks to put everybody in a box and categorize people and shut people out. And it also leaves behind this outdated expectation of this either or mindset in how we're supposed to show up as men. And like I said, steps more towards that both and approach. So in terms of the messaging, I've had some great response. Some of probably the thing that made my heart smile the most is I had a gentleman say to me, I wish I had read this book when I was in high school. He said, this should be mandatory reading for all high school students, men, boys, girls, whatever. Because he said, if I had had this message back then, it would have changed the way that I showed up in the world and would have saved me so much emotional trauma and struggle in my life. And I was just like, wow, like, yes, that's part of why I'm putting this out there, is because whether you're a man or not, or you identify as a male, there's still relevance in the book, because we all influence the narrative of how we as a society define what it means to be a man. And whether it's consciously or unconsciously, we're reinforcing either healthy or unhealthy masculinity. And so for the people that, say, well, I don't identify as a man, you've got someone in your life that does, whether it's a son or a brother or a father, a husband, a partner, whatever. And so what I know is we all need to be in conversation together in order to bring out meaningful and lasting change. And that's how we start to shift the narrative and make this next generation of men healthier and embracing healthy masculinity.
The one thing I've heard from another author, they were talking about how men have really lost their voice for the most part in the public forum because we've been silent so much, where other areas of society have been more vocal and get more attention. For men, it's been pretty quiet. And we haven't really been, again, vocal and spoken up for what we believe and who we are. And that makes it a little bit awkward in the sense that we've lost our platform. So how do we gain our platform back?
Well, part of it is we've got to be honest and real with ourselves. Again, it starts there. And you're right. I think several years ago, when a lot of the Me Too stuff was coming out, like it almost became a crime just to be a man. And that doesn't take away from what happened, because we are living in a very patriarchal society that honestly, because I'm a man, I have privilege over others, right? Now, some of it I don't have because I'm a Black man in America. That's a whole nother story. But what happens is, if we don't ourselves step up and say, okay, so where do we need to change things? Where do we need to own the problems we're creating? We can't move forward. So it starts with us, doing that gut check, that inward reflection, and then saying, okay, so here's where we as men in our society need to make a difference. What are we going to do to work to change it? And then how are we going to invite others in so that we can work on it together? Because we can't solve all of these ourselves, right? It is going to take all of us. But that's where it starts, and it will be challenging because there will be some people that say, well, you're a man, so of course you feel like you should speak up and have a voice. Well, everybody deserves to have a voice. And I think we've maybe stepped back a little too much because we're worried that we're going to get this privilege card thrown in our face or something else. And it's actually not about that. It's how do we be in community and conversation with each other?
What's interesting for the Dad Space podcast we have is that we have moms that are listening as well. So maybe single moms, single parents. What's your message to them in the absence of a dad within the home? How do we instill great values of a dad when there's an absence and a void of a dad in that space?
So my parents divorced when I was 4 years old, and between then and when he died when I was 13, I can count on one hand the number of times I saw him. And I don't even know if any of those were positive interactions. So I grew up without a father in my life. I had some other male role models. I'm never going to say that moms should try and be dads, just like dads should never try and be moms. They both bring something different. But what I think needs to happen is we need to make sure that we are sharing messaging for all kids around how to be healthy, good humans, and less about what they should or should not do because of their gender or how they identify. So I think that's a part of it. There's a buddy of mine, Josh Levs, is doing a lot of great work in the world around gender equality. He wrote a book called All In several years ago, and I became a fanboy of his when he did. But he talks about how more and more men want to be involved in parenting and all of that stuff, like the caretaking, the house care, all that stuff. But the perception is that dads are second-class citizens. And that's part of what we need to shift, because when you think about it, we talk a lot about, all right, when you think about parents, moms take care of their kids, dads babysit. Well, so in that messaging, you're automatically saying that dad is less than as a parent. I used to have a t-shirt that said, dads don't babysit. It's called parenting. And a woman said to me once, I was in the airport, she goes, what do you mean? Yeah, they do. And I said, really? I said, so do you babysit your kids? She goes, no, I take care of them. I said, so why would it be any different with me and my daughter? And she kind of just didn't know what to say. And I said, and there you go. And I walked away. But part of it is we need to also make sure that we're giving men messaging that being an involved parent and being actively engaged in the upbringing of your children is a responsibility, but it's also celebrated. When my daughter was born, I had to educate my workplace about parental leave. I was working construction at the time. I had men that were older men, but I got comments like, what are you doing? Raising kids is women's work, right? And to them, they were an older generation than me, but to them, men don't take care of kids. And so that's some of the things that we have to overcome, because if this next generation of men growing up sees fathers that weren't involved, they think that's what I'm supposed to do. And so that's, again, where we need to start thinking about what are the narratives that these kids are seeing, and that's what they're going to conform to. That's what they're going to seek to become. So when you show a dad who's engaged, who can work or do all the other things, or even be a stay-at-home dad, I am so glad there are so many more stay-at-home dads than there were before. Then they start to see, that's accepted. That's part of what it means to be a man. And so that's what they work towards.
It's living the example.
Yeah, absolutely. You think back to the role models that you had, and this is not a knock in any way on the men from previous generations. Like I think of my grandfather. He emigrated to Canada when he was 10 years old, I think, and he became a farmer in the prairies of in Manitoba. He had a hard life and he worked hard, but he didn't necessarily show a lot of emotion. Now, I don't criticize him for that, because that's what he grew up seeing. That's what he knew. But if we don't shift the cycle somewhere, we're going to keep sending those messages. And a lot of the men that I talk to, they will say, my father wasn't really, he didn't show a lot of emotion. Not always, but a good number of them say he didn't show a lot of emotion. Or they say, I remember the one time I saw my dad cry. And so again, it creates this message of, if I look, you think about the first real role model you have is your dad, and you see this is the way he behaves, he doesn't show emotion, all this stuff. It's well, I can't be like that because I want to be like him. And so again, I'm a broken record, but I'll say we've got to keep giving the examples of where men are doing that, because then it shows us that we have more range instead of having to be in this narrow little box of what it means to be a man.
So the book is The Whole Man. What is the message from the book that we can share today?
Yeah. There's so much, but like, what's the key? It's really, I want to key on it. It's about, we need to find our way back to wholeness, and we need to evolve masculinity. So in it, I talk about, when I wrote the book, I really wanted it to be a little bit my story, a little bit the story of men I talked to, but also a way to look at how have we gotten here? So looking back kind of historically and in society, how masculinity has been held. And then in the middle of the book, I talk about the 5 habits of the whole man. And so it actually spells CAPES is the acronym. So it's curiosity, awareness, presence, emotional health, and stay. And so what each of them are, curiosity it's a question or a wondering and an openness to explore, right? It has to start with curiosity. Then you move to awareness, recognizing where you are and where you need to go based on that curiosity. Presence is about slowing down and connecting. It's filtering out the distractions and ultimately being present to your life in this moment, and not stuck on what do I need to do tomorrow, next week, next month, but really being present with the people in your lives right now. Emotional health is about building and sustaining emotional well-being. And really what I say is developing emotional fitness. And then the last one is stay. And that's really remaining and doing the hard work and like resisting that urge to run when it gets hard, because when you stay, that's when you start to make the big leaps and the transitions. And so if we can start to practice these things, what we're going to understand is we get a better sense of where we are and where we need to go. So in terms of that key message, it's that we need to evolve as men and as a society in the way that we hold masculinity. We need to let go of a limiting and narrow view of what it means to be a man and embrace a both and approach. To really be a whole man is to accept who we are and also grow into who we need to become for humanity.
And there it is.
And there it is.
It's excellent, Christopher. So how do people connect with you, Christopher? How do people get in your world and make that connection?
Yeah. So the simple thing, the book, you can find it at wholemanjourney.com is the website. It's also on Amazon and a lot of other places you can find books, but that's the easiest way. Again, the book is The Whole Man Evolving Masculinity. You can also find me on LinkedIn. It's Christopher Veal, Veal like veal Parmesan. I've heard them all. And you'll know you found the right person because my little tagline is Vulnerability Vanguard. Those are probably the easiest 2 ways. And, I'm here and there on social media, although I don't do a lot of it because it's not important to me. There's other things I got to do. And people tell me you should be doing social media, but yeah, that's not that a big a deal. So those are the best ways. And, I'm always open to having conversations. I love talking with people that, whether they're in the same space and want to share this message or just curious, happy to talk and support people that are looking to make a difference too.
And the podcast.
That's right. See, there you go. I forgot. I was so stuck. And the Vulnerable Man, the Vulnerable Man podcast. And so that website is vulnerable-man.com. Yeah. And that's where you get all your normal podcast stuff.
I love everything you've talked about today, Christopher. So thankful that you had time today to go through this with us and share your message. Really appreciate your heart and the fact that you are coming with the desire to see men do better, be better for their families, for themselves. Appreciate your time today on the podcast.
Yeah. Thank you for having me, David. I've really appreciated it.
Excellent. Everyone go check him out. Make sure you go give him a follow, listen to his podcast, and buy the book.
Yes, buy the book.
Thanks, Christopher. Thanks for listening to Dad Space today. Go check us out on all of our social media, YouTube, all that great stuff. You can find us as Dad Space Podcast. Real simple. Dad Space Podcast, whether you're on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, even YouTube. Email us, dadspacepodcast@gmail.com. We're always looking for great guests to come on the podcast. If you have any feedback for us, what do we do good? What do we need to work on? Let us know here at Dad Space. Looking forward to connecting with you on the next episode. It's coming up right now. Just let this keep playing and it'll automatically come. Follow us on your podcast app for more. Cheers. To you, Dad. Thank you.